The wind came in low and hard that afternoon, a thin thing that scraped the plains clean and left the light looking like it had been rubbed with coarse cloth. She had been walking along the riverbank with the child walking slow at her side. His small shoulders pulled into his coat, his eyes on the melting ice, when the ground under them began to sing, a distant rumble that grew like a drumbeat until the air itself seemed to shift. For a moment she thought it was thunder, though the sky was too pale for thunder. Then she saw the flash of dark shapes on the far plain, a moving shadow that filled the wide air like storm cloud, and she understood. Buffalo. A herd come down from the hills in a sweep, a living, breathing mass, bodies like rounded hills and heads like the dark moons of the earth, and they were coming straight for the river crossing. The boy stiffened. He had been walking even though he should have ridden. He should have been on the horse the way boys in the settlement were, but the horse had been lame, and they had walked because what else could they do? The crash of hoof and hide was still far, but it carried a low, threatening drum, the land vibrating underfoot. She moved without thinking, the way people do when the body knows what the mind has not yet accepted. She took his hand, hard, and would have pulled him to higher ground. But then the herd turned, an answering wind, and a whole flank of animals angled and spilled toward the shallow ford where the water was narrow and the ice cracked and the ground was slick. There was no time to run. The boy looked over his shoulder at her with wide, dark eyes, and in that look she saw something like correct reckoning. A child's tally of danger, and at once a decision that frightened her more than the herd did. He turned and tried to move back toward the horses. One of the young bulls had broken the line, had seen movement, and it shifted like a wave toward the riverbank where they stood. She lunged. She had pulled boys out of fights, mended dolls, cautioned bold children from climbing too high, but she had never thought herself a rescuer. Her hands were not sure, her arms were not used to this. Still she ran and grabbed the child's coat and dragged him down behind a basalt rock, half dunked in mud from spring thaw. She pulled his body against hers and held him there, while the air trembled with the stamp of hooves. A crash of fur and horn hit the slope above them and a spray of dirt flew into their faces. She tasted iron and river mush on her tongue. The boy's breath was a tight thing in her ear. He was small, shrunken in winter clothes that had seen better years, his cheeks flayed by cold and something like hunger. She could smell the river on him, a wet, clean smell that belonged to children who had been sleeping in barn lofts and in damp blankets. For a long moment they were nearly flattened by the sound, the buffalo passing, the ground rolling in waves, the air filling with the low scent of animal and dust. When the last of the herd thundered past them, it felt like a hand passing over their heads. And when the noise died, the world seemed too large and too empty. The boy did not move. He stared at the place where the herd had been, like a man watching a warship sail away. His mouth was open. A small sound escaped him, more a whisper than a word. He had been saved, yet the saving had the same sharp taste as loss. She wrapped her coat tighter around both of them. The coat was wool and heavy and smelled of smoke and old sweat, and she noticed how small his hands were, how the fingers trembled despite the cold. She kissed the top of his head, although such gestures were not for boys, and felt foolish and fierce. People crossing the prairie had a way of walking that was like carrying a private grief. Small acts repeated to keep from thinking too deep. She had her own griefs, a quiet collection of disappointments stacked like kindling. She tied the boy's hood tighter, checked his boots, and found a wound on his shin where a sliver of horn had come close. Then she walked him back toward the settlement, had him totter, helped him into an empty wagon, and sat with him while the farmer took them in to the small clinic under the church. The doctor patched the shin with practiced hands. The child would live. The doctor, a man with tired eyes and a permanent cough, asked her where she had found him. She said the riverbank, and that was the truth, because the riverbank had been where she had gone to think, and because the plain had been where the herd had sent them to the very edge. The boy would not speak for reasons she did not press. He ate bread and drank water and folded like a small, wind-torn thing into sleep against her shoulder. In the dark of the clinic she smoothed the child's hair back from his forehead and listened to the ragged breathing that was still held by fear and cold and the body's insistence on life. She had a name. They called her Mara. She had come west because there was nothing left to keep her in the east. No inheritance, no kin, only the quiet sense that she must build a home where the air was raw enough to make bones feel honest. She had a homestead, a single room added to a long, low house that had once been a shack. She had a stove, a rocking chair, a rocker she had carved with her own hands. The rocker had come to be the place where she watched, weather, and waited. Her hands knew the rhythm of mending, of feeding, of pushing a stubborn plow. People said she was a peculiar woman because she spoke too little, because she kept to herself with the steady dignity of someone who had counted on no one to come. She did not feel peculiar. She felt like someone who had been trimmed to a shape that fit. Now, with the child asleep, she did not know where the shape would settle. In the morning the color of the sky changed in a way that made the whole world look new, like a coin recently polished. The air was sharp and smelled of horse and dry grass. She wrapped a blanket around the boy and carried him across the yard to the wagon where the horses stamped and breathed steam. She meant to bring him to the sheriff and have him placed where he could be kept safe until kin were found. She had done favors for neighbors before, handed over lost tools, let a neighbor's steer into her field to graze. The sheriff was the proper person for an orphan child. She was moving the wagon when she heard the hoofbeats on the road. That first sound was not loud, but it carried in the cool of the morning like a promise. Several horses rounded the bend and came toward the trading post like a small, weathered thunder. At first she thought it was one of the gangs that sometimes came through to sell pelts or to buy fuel, but the riders wore different clothing, not the store-bought jackets of the traders, nor the wool of the cattlemen. Their garments were plain and dark, but the way they rode was the thing that marked them, a straight-backed, sure way of mounting and control that said they belonged to the land in a way that went deeper than ownership. There were many of them, at least 100, perhaps more, their ranks spilling down the slope like a river of shadows. The leader rode forward, a broad, massive horse beneath him, and as he drew in he seemed to shape the world with his presence. A tall man, enormous enough to make the air between them feel smaller, his face painted in the simple manner of war, with lines that ran from the eye like the bark of trees. They were Comanche, strong and whole in a way that left the traders whispering, and they came up the road in a tide of hoof and color that made the hawks wheel in the sky. She had seen Comanche riders at a distance before, passing on errands, their horses muscled and quick, the men and women who rode them wrapped with the economy and beauty of people who had been learning a land for longer than any settler could count. She had never seen so many of them gather before her door. The leader dismounted with the light, fluid motion of someone who spends all his life on horseback. He came up to the wagon. He was enormous and his face was older than she expected, with a measured patience that seemed like a rock in the river. He bowed less as a courtesy than as an acknowledgement of a meeting. Two small lives intersecting, a woman and a child and the river between them. He spoke to her in his own language first, a soft, low thing. Then he turned to the others and they murmured answers like a chorus. She did not speak their tongue. She did not know what to say. The sheriff, who had been called suddenly and stood at the post, hat in hand, a man who never knew how to look small enough before the world, came running up and made the sort of legal gestures that people make when they want to take account. The leader of the riders looked at the boy and at her and then looked again at her eyes, and in that look there was no mockery. There was just a view that took in detail the small kindnesses that had been handed down like private law. He stepped forward, and though he did not laugh he nodded my way, an old and living sort of thanks. The sheriff's face was small, almost hurt by the presence of something he could not claim. He took a step forward as if to make something official. The leader shook his head and made a small motion with his hand. The Comanche began to speak among themselves in low tones, and the words struck through the air like birds in flight, precise and unhurried. A few of the riders moved away from the main group and approached the farmer who had called them out of the fields. It turned out there had been talk in the late spring of a herd striking a boy. The woman at the riverbank had not known everything. The Comanche had monitored the grass and the buffalo, and boys on the lower trail who had been careless had been lost or nearly lost before. The leader asked if they might look at the boy, and Mara sat very still while the elder crouched and reached out with the slow hands of someone who has touched many skins and knows the difference they make. He took the small hand in his own and turned it over. The boy flinched, but not from bitterness. The surge of their voices was like wind in grass. The elder asked questions the sheriff could not ask. He named the river where they had come from and the band they had last been near, and he asked if their horses were loose, and if any of the men at the trading post had been marking the trail. His accent was not a language that could be bought or sold. The farmer answered with small, hurried words. The Comanche closed ranks and began to look as if they might remain. A whispering parliament that looked like it had the power to hold the horizon. She had never been afraid of Comanche riders. Fear was the wrong word. She had been wary because her life had been built on small agreements and on the hope that people would not take more than what had been offered. The sight of so many at once made her stomach hollow out with the old, exacting sense that things had tipped in scale. The leader turned again to her and spoke with an ease she did not understand. He then nodded toward the boy and made a gesture that her flat mind told her was a question. Why had he been away? Why alone? The sheriff made a sound like a man trying to repair a fence with his words. He said the boy had wandered, that the boy had gotten lost, that sometimes that happened, and that the woman had found the boy and had brought him in. The leader's face did not change. He did not ask to see papers or prove a claim. His eyes were just holding the child like a ledger. In the rim of one eye she thought she saw something like recognition. The elder pointed to the sky toward the east and then to the boy, then drew his hand along his own jaw and shook his head in a small negative motion. The suggestion was that the boy was not from their group. The sheriff made a small, amused smile. He said there were many wanderers and many vagabonds in spring. The leader's lips flattened. The question shifted to one about the herd that had cut through the river that morning. He and his men conferring, they said they had been watching that herd for days and had been trying to nudge it along away from the settlements. A few of the younger men had been out trying to drive the buffalo from the crossing, and one of them had seen the boy on the river. That they had not arrived in time to keep the buffalo from moving was just the sort of problem that raised their voices like wind does the long grass. They looked to Mara as if she might explain. She explained plainly. She had found the child in the near bank and had dragged him behind a rock. The leader listened and then flinched ever so slightly at the description, like someone who had been set to remember a bruise. He made a small sound and put his hand on his horse's flank as if to steady something. Then, without a great maneuver, he did something that lightened the room. He stepped aside and gestured that they would leave a small guard and go. A group of younger riders pried themselves from the main body and came to stand near the clinic and around the yard in a slow half-circle, their horses quiet, hocked, and patient. Mara felt seen in a way that made her wary and not, as some might think, shameful. Their presence was not fear. It was a remembering that the land required constant watching. They were not barbarians on horseback in her mind. They were people who had tightened the world into a seam and who watched it for tears. The sheriff thanked them in a high voice and offered tea and food, but the leader declined with a small laugh and a short, half-nodding bow. He asked one thing, the use of her well house to give the boy water and that they might come in to speak to him, to see if the boy knew which people he belonged to. Mara considered for a moment. There was no law that said she had to refuse a people who feared for their child. She led him in. The boy, when woken, blinked slow like a man who had been turned and reawakened under a different moon. The elder came inside and sat and set his hands on his knees and watched the boy with the patience of a man who had lost many children to river and to cold and to the careless march of beasts. He spoke softly to him. The words were not like music and neither were they foreign. They came like water over stones. The boy looked up and answered, in a voice that was small but certain. His words made ears look toward them. He used a name for the leader that rippled with familiarity. The leader's eyes moved and the whole group outside shifted like a sail catching. The boy had a name that had been forgotten, one that folded into the lean map of the plains. He had been with a small white family who had passed away or been taken by sickness. He had been found near a farm many miles north. The leader's voice was not loud. It was steady and contained, and in it was an offering, not a demand. Would she let them take the boy back to the fold? Would she trust them to bring him home? The offer came with a look that weighed less than the whole of harm but more than the hollow of loneliness. Mara thought of the boy's pale hands, of the small wound at his shin, of the way his breath had fit into the hollow of the night. She thought of the rocker she had carved and of the empty cradle she had never let sit long in the corner. She had built her life on the idea of home as a thing people made themselves, and yet an older idea tugged at her. That home was where one belonged by memory and blood, and that to take a child, however tenderly, into a tapestry that was not his might be to unthread him into pieces. The sheriff cleared his throat, anxious, and said the boy could be put in the care of the county, that there were rules. The leader smiled in a way that was both amused and saddened, as if to show that rules were a language the world had taught him to translate into other, clearer things. He said he would leave a man to watch the boy until they could bring him home, that he would bring him in 3 days, and that until then they would leave a dozen men to help with watching the herd and with any dangerous tasks to repay in labor the hospitality. The sheriff wanted receipts and signatures. The leader offered a handshake instead, a compact of hands that warmed and closed in a human way. Mara considered the 2 options, the law and the pact. The law would keep the boy in an office with forms and a lady who would not understand the names of the hills he called home. The pact meant that the child would return to a people who remembered him, who spoke his language and whose horses had replenished his fear with kin. She chose the pact. She signed no paper. She asked the leader only one question. Why had he left so many men behind? The leader's face folded with a thought like a stone dropped in water. He said the plains had been restless. The buffalo had shifted. There were rumors of new hunting parties to the west and of men who would kill more than they needed. They had come because the boy had been seen and because blood remembered its children. They were here for that reason and for the herd and for the living law of a people who keep their own. She nodded, felt right. The boy clung to her as they prepared the horse for travel, and the leader knelt and touched the boy's hair like a blessing. Mara felt the pressure on the top of her chest like a hand pressing gentle and fierce. The leader lifted the boy and placed him on his horse with such deftness that Mara thought the man must have loved the child before they spoke a word. The boy's face registered a small, private kind of relief as he leaned forward against the man's chest, and Mara's breath, which had been a taut wire all morning, loosened. The morning sun made everything look younger and less certain. She watched them ride away, the horse cutting through the pale air like someone who had not been stopped in a long time. The tide of riders followed, slow, neat, their lines a living order that drifted and then closed. They were gone in less than an hour, the ground still shaking a little where they had passed. The sheriff stood with his hat in his hand and asked if she would come in to town for questions. She said she would not. She had a house to mind and a stove that liked to be fed. The sheriff looked at her as if she were the last keeper of some old order, which perhaps she was. When she had finished her chores, she sat in the rocker and felt the wood answer back under her. The morning had a small, clear edge, and she wrapped the blanket anew. She did not know that the hill above her house had a few pairs of eyes watching, Comanche men and women hidden and sitting in small knots, their presence a comfort more than a threat. They had walked their horses in and had bedded them on the low slope so they could remain near without being intrusive. They had not intended to trouble her. They had intended simply to put the world back into the frame where it belonged. In the hush that followed, she felt that a small thing had changed. The world had altered its course by the width of a child's breath, and that alteration filled her with a quiet, opening pain like the twinge in a newly healed bone. The day moved on, the sun shifting its shoulder, and in the evening a messenger horse slipped into the farm with a note tied to its bridle. It was from the leader. He had ridden back alone to say thank you again, and to ask if she would come to a feast the next day to meet his people, to be thanked properly. She read the note and felt a light rise in her that she did not name. She did not go to feasts, not because she thought herself above them, but because feasts involve time and room and the sort of soft danger that let friendship sit and grow like plants. Yet she knew something essential. Sometimes a small kindness makes the road back appear by itself if you look at it. She decided to go. She boiled a pot and filled it with stew and shoved warm bread into her knapsack. And in the evening she sat back in the rocker and listened to the wind stitch itself through the fence. The world had shifted, and she felt a new shape settling in her like a shared blanket. She did not know how wide that shape would stretch, or how many doors it would call in the night, only that it had begun. The invitation lay on Mara's kitchen table like a sliver of sky on a table of dust. Ink dark as river silt looped in careful strokes across a scrap of paper. The leader's name and hour, the place where the Comanche camp had taken root along the far bend. She smoothed the page with a thumb, watched the dust lift and settle again, as if some small wind had breathed through the room. Outside, the late sun bled pale across the low hills and the homestead creaked in the cooling air. She had folded and refolded that scrap 3 times before she slipped it into the inside pocket of her coat where nothing else lived but a single button and a napkin she used to dry her hands. The boy's small boots lay by the hearth, cleaned and set out, and she moved around them like a careful animal. He had woken with the reaction of a child who had been given back to the world. Wide eyes, a cautious smile that reached one cheek more than the other, then sleep creeping back in with the steady certainty of a breathing stove. Mara had watched him sleep until the light told her it was time to move. The Comanche scouts were nearby. She could see the gleam of steel and the purposeful shapes of their horses if she went to the knoll. She did not go now. She brewed coffee strong enough to sting and wrapped another wool blanket around her shoulders, though the day still held warmth. Small gestures had become the way she spoke after the boy. A soft boot placed by a young chest. A plate slid closer on the table. A word now and then when the child laughed so simply that she could not keep it in her chest. The sheriff had stayed at the trading post, the doctor had returned to his family, and the land carried on as if all that had happened was what life required. Injuries, rights, the passage of other lives across it. But everything had shifted a millimeter and the shift was enough. She made her slow way to the knoll, the coat heavy on her arm like a reconciled thing. The scouts saw her before she saw them. They did not ride toward her or show teeth. The leader stood a little apart, 2 men at his side. His horse a dark thing with a white snip on its nose that looked like a moon cut out of night. He gripped the reins with the same hand he might grip a child's wrist. Mara had seen hands that could kill and hands that could hold a small wrist with the same honesty. His face, when she looked at it, was a map of other winters. Fine lines that meant nothing in the way of cruelty, eyes quiet as a pond. He inclined his head. There was a small distance between them that felt like the country itself, wide and full of wind. She had rehearsed nothing. She had learned that rehearsed things sounded false in the presence of people who had lived by instinct and by loss. He spoke in his own tongue first, and one of the scouts translated with a voice that was careful and bare. The leader said he had come for the boy because the boy's name belonged to his band and the band's memory. He said he had come because the prairie remembers those it has swallowed and gives back in time. He said he had seen how she had stayed when the buffalo tore, and that the camp had watched. He said they owed gratitude the way other people owed coins. He said, finally, that the feast was small and that he wished to share it with her as a neighbor does when he brings coffee to a lone widow. Mara thought of ways to refuse. She pictured the sheriff's possible look, the legal shape of things stacked on papers thicker than her palm. She pictured, too, the boy's shins, newly healed, still blinking away the ghosts of dust, and the way the leader, when he had pressed his palm to the child's shoulder before, had done it like a man laying a hand on a small grave. So she accepted. The decision unfolded not like a bright act but like a folding of old linens. Necessary, a little private and final. They rode slowly the next morning. Mara on her mare, which she had coaxed from the stable with the patient talk of someone who has always preferred company to spectacle. The scouts rode beside her like seasons. The land shifted around them and the air tasted of bluegrass and the dry promise of rain. At the camp, the teepees rose like a town of brown tulips, not loud and not meant to awe. Embers puffed smoke. Pots clinked quietly. A woman with hair as thin as thread tended a quiet fire, and she smiled at Mara with the small authority of someone who had seen too many people to be surprised by any single one. The leader dismounted and offered Mara his hand. She hesitated only a breath before she took it, and in that act a thin, honest thing unrolled from both of them. The simple recognition of 2 people who had saved a child and nothing more. They moved through the camp without hurry. Children darted between legs, curious, unafraid. The boy, now called by the name the leader had given him, watched Mara with an attention that made him glow like a lantern. He clutched a rag doll given in trade by a woman whose fingers were quick and sure. Mara met that look and felt in it something like the same light she had when she bent to mend a fence. A small, certain usefulness. They seated her near the leader in a place that was neither honored nor common. It was precisely the place where a guest eats so her name does not grow too fast in the mouths of those who do not yet understand her. Food came in bowls and on platters, warm and seasoned with things the trading post could not carry. Roasted roots that tasted of smoke and a sweetness she did not know. A stew thick with greens and small pieces of meat that melted when the teeth met them. Coffee, black, and a kind of tea she had not known warmed her hands and her insides. The leaders of other bands, men from other places she had heard spoken of only in the low, odd way people speak of weather, nodded to her and did not ask about her life. That omission felt like mercy. The feast loosened something in her. She laughed once at a child's story about a coyote who had tried to steal a sleeping man's hat and been taught a lesson not by teeth but by embarrassment. Laughter in Mara had been going rusty for years. It popped like a hinge and then worked smoother. The boy came and sat near her, and when he leaned his head on her knee she did not stiffen. The leader watched them both and said something quiet to the scout that translated. The bond was there and would be kept by both laws, spoken and otherwise. In the middle of the feast, a rider came racing in from the south, a dust wraith with a message. He dismounted and dropped the heavy news at the leader's feet. A landowner to the east had stirred trouble. Men had been sent to drive settlers off a tract that they claimed by rights the law refused to hear. Rumor carried that the man aimed to buy farms cheap, to gather land in the wide, greedy way of men who never step back and look at what they have taken. The leader's face did not change in a way Mara could read easily. There was a tightening at his jaw that was almost invisible and then a slow steadying of posture that made him seem like a rope being pulled taut. He rose and motioned for Mara to come close. The scouts were their near shadow. The leader's voice was low in translation. They mean to take what the earth has given those who work it. They mean to make quiet people speak for what they have. We will go and see. Mara felt the old iron fret in her chest that long winters of alone had made a second skin. She heard the echo of the sheriff's caution. She felt the Comanche word for honor which the scout rendered with the smallest of smiles. The land had not yet been taken from her, but the edges had teeth and men in dark coats who saw homesteads like coins. The leader told her she could stay. She could follow and see what this man wanted and stand for what she had carved from the plain. Mara thought of the homestead, the stove, the small bed where her things lay folded and unmoving like a person in repose. She thought of the boy's laugh and the way he had tucked his small chin into her hand when a dog nosed the food. She thought of other things too. The way the sheriff had shrugged when pressed about law, the way the landowner's men had bought smiles like they bought gates. She rose. She found she was not afraid in the same way she had been before the boy. There was a steadiness to her now, found in the small, sustained acts of care. When they rode into the ribbon of prairie that sheltered the contested tract, the landowner's men were already there. A tangle of tents and loudness and a flag hoisted not by tradition but by a need to be seen. They had ropes, ledger books, and a man who looked like a coal lump, broad and trained to make deals with elbows. He waved a paper and said things that smelled of city air and dollars. The leader stepped forward without a shout. Mara, with the boy at her side, dismounted and walked up to the man, not to shout but to press into the wide skin of daylight until the man could not avoid being seen. His smile was a blade that had been kept oiled for years. "This land," he said, "is to be bought. You all must go." The leader's reply, when it came, was not a law citation. It was instead a line of facts spoken like a knife laid on a scale. This land had seen births and burials, it had known who read weather and who read tracks, it had taken and it had given, and those who had kept it were the ones who really remembered what it required. He called the land the people's, meaning the people who lived there by daily work. The coal man snarled something about authority and judges and papers with a sort of naked anger people used when their money could not buy what they wanted. The sheriff, who had crept in shadow near the trading post and come with the thin pretense of being busy, stepped into the space and looked at both parties. He blinked at the leader and then at Mara, and in that blink Mara read the thing she had always suspected. Law and injustice sometimes wore the same coat. There was a silence that stretched, and the leader then did something that was little but huge. He beckoned two boys from the camp, the ones who learned to ask with hands instead of taking, and asked them to tell a story. They began simply about a man who tried to claim a prairie because he was greedy and the prairie remembered and would not obey greed. They told of a ravine that refused a road and a boulder that stood like a stubborn god. It would have been comic if it were not so fierce. The coal man's smile thinned. The sheriff coughed and said something about procedure and waiting for the local magistrate. The leader, in a quiet that had the weight of all his winters, said the magistrate could come and see for himself. He invited the man to sit by the fire and listen to the people the land had kept safe. It is a strange thing when your enemy is offered kindness. It presses at the tight places in a man's belly and makes room for a choice. The coal man, who had thought himself lord of small kingdoms built from other men's hardship, balked for a breath and then took off his hat in a formal, sharp way and sat. He listened to the stories of tracking and of kin, and to the names of small dead things thrown into the telling like stones. There were no court records, only thousands of soft facts and the kind of history that was stubborn as bone. The magistrate arrived with an expression of a man who had not expected to be needed to choose between a paper and the memory of a land. He walked the fields, felt the soil with a deliberate hand, and when he left he said the law would not be ignored and that all claims would be reviewed. The coal man, with the theater of his retreat, packed his papers and promised vengeance. Mara felt something loosen in her chest like the first time you open a door, and the air that comes in is cleaner than the air you knew. She turned and found the boy waiting. He had the look of someone who had seen a thing and decided it was right because the people who mattered had been right. He took her hand in both small ones and squeezed. She found herself responding not by words but by touching his shoulder, the way the leader had touched him earlier. When they moved back toward the Comanche camp, dusk folded itself into their ride. The leader and Mara walked with a pace that did not need to be measured in plans. People began to come to them as they left. Farmers who had worked their land with small tools, a woman with a child who smiled with the rawness of gratitude. They thanked the leader in a language Mara did not know, and the leader nodded, as if gratitude should be met with silence sometimes. Back at the homestead that night, Mara set a small table by the stove for the boy. He ate with the ravenous calm of a child who had been through noise and been given quiet. After he slept, she made a small cradle from an old box lined with flannel and set it near the hearth. She sat in the rocker she had always left alone and rocked once, twice, and then more times until the motion filled her chest like a soft bell. She thought of things she had buried. A husband whose grave the prairie kept gentle, seasons that had eaten her patience. None of that returned to make noise. It all folded into something that felt like beginning. The Comanche leader sent a letter the next day, inviting her not merely to the camp but to sit more often as a neighbor, to weave stories around a fire and to watch the boy learn 2 names for wind. He said, without flourish, that the boy could stay with his band but that the band wished a woman like Mara to be near. A witness, a friend, a keeper of small truths. Mara read the line 3 times. Then she walked to the door and pressed her hand flat to the wood as if to see if the house remembered her. It did, but what she felt now was not ownership but belonging. The next weeks came as work does. Steady, unpaid, and full of minor miracles. The boy learned to set little traps for field mice that he then released with an odd, careful pity. He learned to string a line between trees and dangle small charms that the Comanche children had given him. Mara learned the cadence of his speech when he wanted something and when he feared. She learned, too, the leader's way of telling truth. Not loud, not unkind, but final as a well-kept ledger. He would come by and sit and they would say little. Sometimes they would walk the fence line together and measure, not with tape, but with the knowledge of those who had both taken and given ground. The sheriff, finally, came by the homestead without the ease of a man who has made a full account. He sat on Mara's porch and smoked in a way that said apology had weight but too little room. He told her that the landowner had backed down, for now, because his ledger showed more trouble than purchase. The sheriff said it had been the talk of a man whose paper could not keep the silence of people who remembered. Mara listened. She did not claim conquest. She said only, "It was right." The sheriff nodded as if he had expected nothing less. The boy stayed with the band but he was not gone. He came back to Mara's porch like weather that always returns in a season. Sometimes he arrived with the leader on a horse that moved like midnight. Sometimes he arrived on foot with a pocket full of small tokens to trade. He called Mara by a nickname that the leader taught him, a word that meant one who keeps warm. She came to like the word more than she thought she could. Seasons shifted and the homestead grew easier to hold. In the spring, a wooden rocker appeared on Mara's porch, carved by hands with a patient grace from a soldier in the Comanche band who had taught himself to work wood in winter. The leader brought it as a thing of thanks and as a sign that some small homes might be kept by more than one tribe of memory. Mara placed the rocker by the hearth and sat in it until the shape molded to her like a second skin. The boy grew taller in the way children do, leaning into his limbs as if trying on the world. When he ran, he was a small comet across dun grass, and the leader watched him with a look that did not hide the edges of pride. Mara found herself, at odd hours, reaching for his blanket in the morning and then remembering that the boy had many blankets. He belonged to many hands now. It did not make the loss of simple possession bitter. Instead, it sweetened the air. There were nights when she felt the ache of old solitude close like tidewater at her ribs. On those nights she would ride the mile to the camp and sit beside the leader by the fire and let the talk be the kind that does not rescue but simply stitches. He told her small tales of winter roads and children learning to speak 2 words for wind. She told him about a man who had once loved her and left with a folded map and a promise that had no bearing. Between them a language of care built itself. A quiet reaching when bread needed to be lent, a refusal when a man argued for paper over people. A steady presence when the boy woke from a fever with the sweat of a ruined night. Time, that slow, honest thing, kept its rhythm. The boy came of age in the way the land does, quietly and without fanfare, but with a certainty that something had changed. He chose the band as he had been chosen. He also chose Mara with the solemnity of a man who knows the value of small hands in a big world. At a small gathering under the silent stars, the leader made a speech that was not meant for show but for truth. He spoke in simple lines translated edge by edge. He said the boy would ride with the band but that he would keep a home here with Mara, that the boy would be taught 2 ways of the world and that the world would be richer for it. People put their hands to their hearts and to one another's shoulders. Mara felt her throat tighten not with the old grief but with a weight that was warm and exact. The years did what years do. They softened edges and burrowed things into the shape of a life. The homestead kept its windows and its stove. The camp moved with seasons but returned like tides. Children who had once darted between legs now stood tall and taught their children to watch the wind. Mara aged in a way that made her hands more trusted and her silence more communicative. The rocker by the hearth grew creak and familiar. One morning, with frost a thin glass across the pasture, the boy, no longer a boy but a man with the mark of both bands in his posture, returned from the camp with the leader at his side. He had come to the porch with a bundle and with a face that had learned rain and sun. He set the bundle down and opened it to reveal a small carved box and within it a scrap of cloth stained with soil and a worn coin that neither the sheriff nor any paper could value. The leader looked at Mara and said something simple that the scout translated. "You kept him when he needed keeping. He returns with more names and with no less love." Mara put out her hand and the man's hand, the one that was both his and the leader's to shape, met it. It was not a claim. It was not a surrender. It was the mutual pressing of 2 people who had learned what it meant to be keepers. Years later, when Mara sat in the rocker with her hands folded and the light of late day painting the room with the slow gold of spent time, she would find that the house had more visitors than the seasons required. There were meals shared, talks that went on until the pipe went cold, and a boy's children who called her by the name that meant keeper of warmth. The leader would come in with news and with no small patience. Sometimes all they did was sit and watch the wind move the tall grass and not speak. In those silences there lived everything they had conserved. A child's breath, a saved life, a promise kept like a well. From the dust and silence of her first winter after the buffalo, a home had been made not from contracts but from the slow building of trust. From the closing of an old wound had grown a family that no paper could fully name. Mara had never expected a feast to change what years had hollowed. She had only meant to accept a cup of something warm and to be neighborly. What happened was larger than a cup. It was the soft remaking of a life by other hands, steady and honest, hands that respected boundaries and took what is given only when given freely. When the end of her days came some years hence, she did not go alone. Her porch chair was not empty. A child who had once been a man sat near her with a small son folded against his chest. The leader and his scouts came, not in any triumph but in attendance, as one might attend to a last storm passing. Mara breathed out slowly, the world steady and the hearth warm. She had no thought of triumphant speeches. Her last thought, small and clear, was of a boy with a shin healed and a laugh that had loosened something in her chest. The door remained open when they carried her across the threshold she had always kept polished and honored. They buried her on a hill that looked out over the fields she had tended, and both bands placed flowers on the grave, each in their own way, a neat, careful handful or a scattering like the wind. The leader carved a small rocker of his own and left it leaning against the grave as a sign. The law did not have to decree what the prairie already remembered. Love, where it is quietly tended, grows into law that no paper can erase. We will see you again, where silence means home.